Welcome back to another build video of mine. This time it is the Reggiane 2000 GA from Special Hobby, the very same I made an unbox video of a while ago. If you want to watch that, just click in the link right there on the top right corner there. Otherwise, we will get right into the building. And whilst I'm building up the cockpit, which is nothing to write home about to my beloved mother, let me tell you that my enthusiasm to this kit diminished quite a bit during the build. There are quite a few things which almost made me abandon it multiple times, but it wasn't the cockpit, I can tell you that much. That was relatively easy. All the hardship came after. You can see me assemble a tank and the radio equipment here, which goes behind the pilot's seat. Now these parts are literally covered up completely, so in hindsight the work which went into it was for nothing, I guess. Unless someone would want to build it with an open canopy and the seat folded forward. The cockpit walls were the best of them all in terms of detail, but then again, due to the fuselage being very curvy, you can't really see much of it anyway. After assembly, I sprayed the cockpit with my own made-up color based on some information on the website stormomagazine.com and other sources. The general consensus was that there is no right or wrong in terms of cockpit if one goes with a relative light grey, greenish color as there was with German RLM color schemes. So I went and did a mixture of 70% Mission Models MMP 80, which is RAF underside sky grey, and 30% of MMP 100, which is Russian cockpit emerald green. And whilst at it, I also painted the instrument panel, the radial engine and props with black primer. Now comes the detailing part. Most of these are painted black, I guess for visibility even when the sun is directly shining into the cockpit. Then the buttons and knobs got the grey or white treatment. I tried to find some images on the subject, but sadly there weren't too many, especially the ones which weren't black and white. For an extra aid, I did use War Thunder as well to have just the kind of a feel how it might have looked in the real life. Although, again, I am not a big rivet counter or realist for that matter. I just wanted to make it look good or decent. Well, for myself at least. This canister thingy next to the seat was the exception, which I really wanted to stand out with a bright red. The instrument panel decals did leave a lot to be desired. The lines on the print are quite big and there is not much to it other than white. After a good coat of satin varnish, I went and slobbered on a lot of enamel panel liner wash onto the cockpit surfaces. I deliberately made my color mixture lighter as I knew the varnish and wash will darken it afterwards. And don't be afraid to be too generous here. Everything can be cleaned up nicely with cotton buds and if you need, some white spirit as well. With enamel washes, I usually wait a good half an hour before I tack it with my trusty cheap cotton buds. With the oils, you might want to extend it at least for an hour or so. If you come across hard to reach places, I recommend using a small tip brush with just a tiny hint of white spirit on it to loosen up those pesky stains and move them around or even to clean them up. Now I do some chipping with aluminum paint. The assembly of the cockpit was okay and hassle-free, although some placement tabs and pins would have been nice. The lack of these things is going to be an overall theme with this kit, I can tell you that. Next up is the fuselage and the rear landing gear bay. Its doors came molded together with the internals, so I had to cut them off and glue them in place. Luckily, their sizes did match up perfectly with the fuselage halves. Marrying the two fuselage halves together wasn't easy because of the lack of positioning tabs and pins, and also it seemed like there was some misalignments, so I tried to work my way around the fuselage slowly and make sure every part is lined up as best as possible. To be extra sure, I used masking tape to hold the back together whilst I was gluing the front. Oh boy, now comes the fun part. The landing gears weren't my favorites on this build, I can tell you that right now. Already I had to chop the struts, should I call it struts? Yeah, I think I will call it struts. So anyway, those not being the right length made it hard to put everything together and put it into place, because again, things don't fit well on this kit. And that nice gap just shows how well these things don't fit together. And here comes Perugu to the rescue. And another shining example how manufacturers don't care to make sure that wheels and the landing bay, etc. are the same size. Because here, as you can see, I had to use only half of the wheel because a full wheel wouldn't fit into the bay. And this is another fun part right here. The wheel wells being so chunky and thick that the wings can't fit together. So here you can see me sanding like a maniac, trying it multiple times, making sure that the wings can fit together without being too bulky on the top. So I don't know in the end if I did something wrong, or it is a design flaw, but for me, this just didn't work right out of the box. I don't know what they did during design, but I don't see this fit together well without any extra work put into it. So after sanding it down to be as thin as possible, I also used some masking tape to help me glue the wing halves together so they won't come apart whilst the glue was drying. Now this middle section will hold quite a surprise later on. Here I used some masking tape to prop up the wings against the wing roots, whilst I was gluing them in place. Without this there would have been a massive gap between the fuselage and the wings, and also the wings placement would have looked quite weird in my opinion. Here you can see all the sprue glue fillings, which gave me endless amount of joy in the form of sanding and scraping. With a bit of water and some sanding sponges, I did a bit of wet sanding first on the bottom part of the wing section. If you're afraid to lose any panel lines during a big sanding session party, I would recommend to use a rescriber to make them a bit deeper from time to time. Now this is one of the Revell products I would highly recommend to anyone. This scraper is really good at removing seam lines, excess plastic, or even blobs of leftover sprue glue. After a time which felt like eternity, I did divert my attention to the engine and glued all the separate tappets in place. I think they're called tappets, but let me know in the comments section if I'm wrong. I used a bit of sprue glue to make these joints a bit more sturdy, and then later cut off the excess with a hobby knife. For the base color, I used the same color mixture I made for the cockpit. After that dried, I used some black on the tappets because they are going to be painted metallic colors later on. For those rod midsections I used the steel color, and for the ends I used brass. After I black primed and painted the radial engine main parts with AK Extreme metals, I used a bit of wash on it made from Mission Models tire black. And the rocker boxes were painted black. Done with all the painting, I assembled the engine and glued it into place. I also painted the inside of the cowling and the fuselage at the back of the engine with my cockpit green mixture, then sealed it in with satin varnish and gave it a quick dirty up with an enamel wash. And here it is. Now you can see the biggest problem I had with this kit. I don't know what the engineer was thinking, but clearly they managed to mismeasure things quite a bit. So what I ended up doing is taking a tail wheel from another kit, wedged it in the big gap, and then poured as much sprue glue into the hole I possibly could. After a day, everything got rock solid again, so I had a whale of a time cutting, scraping and sanding again and again and again. I know there could have been a better way, but I just went with this one. After the sanding, scraping and all that good fun was over, I used my trusted little panel liner to scrape some panel lines in where the fuselage meets with the cowling. Now that the suffering has ended, I got to the place where I wanted to be in the very beginning, and that's when I paint the crazy camo scheme of 4 colors. So after a coat of grey primer, I used the RLM 65 on the underside. I know it's not the right one, but I found this to be the closest to the colors based on some research I did before. And if you don't like it, well, you know what they say, it's my plane, my choice. Masked off the bottom parts afterwards and went over the top with sand grey, which is from Mission Models MMP 16. Now I'm going over on top of the sand grey and I'm doing the brown spots. Well, they start out as nice brown spots, but later on they turn into little brown worms, so to speak. I guess consistency is not my thing. Sadly, I did have a lot of tip dry here. I tried to alleviate it with making the paint thin, but it still kept on going. Perhaps it's one of the things with water-based acrylics that you cannot get away from. I am seriously thinking to create a better paint booth with proper ventilation and start using lacquers for this. Now it's time for the third color of the camouflage scheme, and this is dark green. I used the German RLM Dunkelgrün for this one. Again, it's probably not the best, but it was good enough for me anyway. Now that we have mentioned consistency, again, I really managed to mix things up with this scheme. This green should have been like similar to the brown, like spots, but bigger ones, usually touching 2 or 3 or maybe 4 of the brown spots or overlapping with them. Well, for me it turned out to be some kind of crazy swirly wormy pattern in the end, so yeah, it's not even close what it should have been. But the reason why I kept on going was that I knew that on top of this is still going to be a 4th color, which is a lighter green, which should really cover up a lot of this mistake and hopefully get everything together into the same position as it should have been in the first place. Sorry for this ugly video part. It's I tried something new, but it clearly failed. Anyway, here you can see me doing the last of the patterns, which is like a mesh kind of thing, and it's done with olive green. So did it turn out to be exactly the same as the instructions, or at least very close to it after this fourth layer of paint? Well, the answer is no, but I think I am pretty happy how it turned out in the end, so I just left it as it is and just moved on with my life. I think we all can agree that this is the best part of a paint job, where you pull the masking tape and you reveal all these nice, fine and very crisp lines. Moving on to paint the red parts, I base painted the nose and the engine cowling with flat white. Now I know that a lot of people would recommend to use either yellow or, for example, orange as an underlying paint for red, but I still like to use white. Somehow I never saw it a problem. I still think that red really pops on a white base. This is the kind of paint job right here which I am really fearful of, because many times I manage to do overspray and such. So I try to lower the PSI as much as possible and go really careful about not to overspray and accidentally spray on that absolutely fantastic paint job that I just did on the whole body. Here I'm using Tamiya's flexible masking tape to mask off where the white stripe will go on the fuselage. I really like to use these masking tapes because they're really good at following curved lines, like for example a plane's body. And I know that a lot of people like to do like this white base first on certain areas where you have like stripes like this, and then mask that specific area off and then paint all the other colors on. But I think it is more realistic to think about that probably that white stripe was the last thing that they actually painted on an aircraft in real life. So I like to do it this way. And for example, invasion stripes as well, those were painted on afterwards. All the planes were painted with the regular camouflage scheme. So I think this is a more realistic way to do these kind of stripes and paintings than the other way around. Let me know in the comment section how you're painting your stripes. Whilst I was rambling about stripes, you can see that I am doing the finishing touches on the cockpit with the headrest and everything. Here I'm doing a quick experiment with mission model paints. As you may know, mission model has 3-part paints. So one is the thinner, the other one is the polyurethane, and the third one is the paint. So if you don't put enough polyurethane into the paint, it can be rehydrated really easily and it can come off with regular water. So I'm trying here some kind of chipping without the hairspray technique, using mission model paints with a very low amount of poly in them. Doing the finishing touches on the tires with some tire black. After all that painting, I finally sealed the deal with a satin varnish and went on doing the decals. Now the decals weren't too bad, but they weren't too good either. They are certainly not as thick as Tamiya ones, and they are certainly not as good as the Cartograph ones. Now with these decals I had a lot of problems with silvering. I don't know if it was due to my bad technique or it was something with the decals. I did experience similar issues with the Edward ones, and Certainly I felt that they are on the same ballpark as those. And other than the silvering issue, the other part that I didn't like too much, that the detail wasn't as crisp, and there weren't too many stencil information on there. But regardless all of these problems, I think they are decent and they responded to microset fairly well and were conforming the surface. Having the decals down, I had to seal that deal as well with a coat of satin varnish. And to move into the final phase of the build, which was the weathering and dirtying up things panel lining, I reached for the usual suspect, which is an enamel AK panel liner. And as you can see, the word sparingly is not really present in my vocabulary, so I just went all in and slobbered the stuff on as if the whole thing would have been dragged out of a swamp. After letting it dry for a good half an hour or so, I went in with a dry Q-tip and tried to clean all that swamp off as much as I could, but still trying to leave some of it on to give this post-shading kind of effect for me, so I don't have to do... Well, I'm trying cutting corners, you know, as they say, work smarter, not harder. Anyway, I don't know if it's something that you would like to try, but it certainly worked for me for a couple of times now, so I think I'm going to keep on doing this. And if you come across a more stubborn part of the so-called swamp, I do recommend to use a Q-tip dipped in white spirit. Rub it on there just to loosen it up, and then use another one, which is preferably dry and clean, to rub off the loosened up excess. Finished with the top part, swampiness, I went on to do the same swampiness on the bottom part of the plane. Now you might think that this is a bit too dirty, but rest assured it's not on the video, but I used way more white spirited Q-tips as with the top part, so I rubbed off a lot of this dirt from the panels themselves. Now how much of this stuff gets stuck onto the surface and how much stains you get, it really depends on, I think, two things. First one is what kind of coat you're using. So if you use a satin or a flat varnish, it's more likely that the oils and enamels get stuck to it way better than a gloss varnish. So you might want to go gloss if you want to make sure that most of the staining will come off eventually. The other thing is that you can always switch to oils instead of enamels, which are way more forgiving, but the downside is that their drying time is way slower. So the canopy masking turned out the same way as it did in December with the Airfix Zero that I made. And yeah, I had to do it freehand again. So the first thing I did here was to paint on the cockpit color on the outside as an undercoat. Another great example why you want to make more of your color mixture, because you never know when you are going to have to reach for it again. Also, even if you have the correct mixture, you know, in percentages or in my case drops, you know, you can still end up with a slightly different shade of the same color because things aren't perfect and we are not using scientific measurements and tools, well, at least I don't, to do our mixes. And you really want to avoid this kind of situation where you mix the same color and then you just realize that, oh, this is a bit different in shade than what I mixed before. So just make enough that will definitely last you for the whole build. finished with the undercoat, well, the cockpit green, I used a toothpick to very gently and carefully scrape off all the excess paint before I went to the next step, which is to paint the olive green color on top, which is the same color that I used to do the final top coat of the camouflage scheme. Now, some of you might point it out, rightfully so, that this is not going to be the same as on the instructions, because the canopy is usually a part of the camouflage, so to speak, so you're not going to have this one type of color coated canopy frame, but rather the whole camouflage is going to be applied onto the canopy frame as well. But for me, this is the situation what happened, so I just went with it, and I think in the end it's okay. Now to seal this deal, I use some gloss varnish, but I haven't masked off the windows because the gloss varnish can act the same way as it would when you dip the canopies into future floor polish. After installing the Venturi tube and painting it with gunmetal, I went on and did some chipping with the AK Extreme Metals aluminium. And as always, I went for the sponge technique, where I took a tiny bit of sponge and dipped it into the paint, getting rid of most of the excess into tissue paper, and then dabbing it around where I think the paint would see the most wear on the aircraft. Having that out of the way, I painted the exhaust with a rust color. And whilst that was drying, I went with some earth tone pigment and dirtied up the tires and the landing gear doors. To mimic the exhaust stains underneath, I used Tamiya weathering master tools. Usually I would have reached out for a shader or a filter that I would spray on with low pressure, but I felt like because it's just a two exhaust system, so probably the staining wouldn't be that big. And here we are, the last stretch, the last steps before I would even glue on the antenna. It is to dust up the wing root surface, where I would think the pilot and the ground crew would leave some dust and dirt on the plane. So here we are, finally it's done. It was a massive amount of 3 months, although I should say that most of the time this plane was sitting in a hangar waiting to be finished. The wait and taking it slow was really paying off, because at first I was really torn about all the shortcomings this model had. but luckily it didn't keep me from finishing it. So you might ask what my take is on this model. Well, first of all, it's definitely not a beginner model, and this comes from a mediocre modeler like myself. There are many problems, many shortcomings, from fit issues to misalignments, mediocre detail. So who is this for? Well, I think this is a good kit for a very experienced modeler or the mediocre modeler who wants to take it to the next step and wants to challenge themselves and do some scratch building and some extra work on the detailing. Clearly I wasn't challenging myself that much with this model, but I am more on the notion that I want to build as many models as possible in the shortest amount of time. Well, not shortest amount, but in a reasonable amount of time, rather than spending countless months or even years on one kit just to make it the absolute perfect. I want to have as many planes in my nice little office as possible. In terms of the subject, I would love to see other manufacturers cover more Italian planes, especially a certain manufacturer from Italy. But I am not going to disown them because finally they came out with the Mackie 202 in 1/32 scale, which I do have, by the way, a nice unboxing video with 4K resolution. So if you want to see all the fine details on the modes, go check it out. The link will be up in the corner. But there is still a huge gap in what we can get for World War II Italian aircraft, which is, I think it's a very overlooked theme. I guess mostly it's due to the fact that most of the Italian planes weren't that great and groundbreaking. And about special hobby, am I going to get another special hobby model? Probably the answer is yes. I do have my eyes on their 1/32 scale Tempest. It looks quite nice, and I assume it does have some problems as well, but now that I know what to expect from the brand, I will have that kind of a mindset, so not going to be chafed too much about problems. And that's all, folks. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, whatever. And I'm hoping that you learned something new and you can use it in your own builds. Other than that, see you on the next one.